In the shadows of World War II, while armies clashed and cities burned, another war was being fought in silence. It was a war for art, gold, and cultural identity. Adolf Hitler and the Nazi leadership did not only seek military conquest, they sought to control history itself by stealing it. Across occupied Europe, Nazi units emptied museums, private homes, banks, and galleries. Masterpieces that had taken centuries to create were stripped from their owners in days. Hitler imagined a grand museum in his hometown of Linz, Austria. It would be the greatest art collection the world had ever seen. To build it, the Nazis created organized systems of theft. Special task forces like the Einsatzstab, Reichsleiter Rosenberg targeted Jewish families, collectors, and dealers. Paintings by Rembrandt, Vermeer, Monet, and countless others were seized. Gold, religious objects, furniture, and personal heirlooms followed. For Jewish families, this was not just robbery, it was erasure. Artworks carried memories, lineage, and identity. When families were forced into ghettos, camps, or exile, their possessions were cataloged and shipped away. Receipts were written, crates were sealed, entire lives were reduced to inventory numbers. Many owners never survived the war, and their names vanished with them. As the Third Reich collapsed, the stolen treasures were hidden in salt mines, castles, and underground vaults. Places like the Altaussee salt mine in Austria held thousands of artworks meant for Hitler's museum. When Allied forces advanced, a race began. The Nazis tried to destroy evidence, while the Allies tried to save it. Enter the monuments men, a small group of American and Allied art historians, curators, and soldiers. Armed with maps, photographs, and determination, they tracked down hidden collections across Europe. They recovered millions of stolen objects and prevented priceless art from being destroyed. It was one of the greatest recovery efforts in history, but recovery was only the beginning. Returning these treasures to their rightful owners proved far more complicated. Families were scattered, records were incomplete, governments changed. Some artworks entered museums, others disappeared into private collections. For decades, many stolen pieces sat in plain sight, their origins ignored or misunderstood. This is the story of those lost treasures, of the vaults that hid them, and of the heirs who are still fighting, generations later, to bring their stolen history back home. Today, the legacy of Nazi looting still shapes courtrooms, museums, and families across the world. Each recovered artwork raises hard questions about justice, memory, and responsibility. Who truly owns the past when so much was taken by force? As new archives open and technology advances, forgotten names resurface, paintings speak again, and long-silenced stories begin to return, demanding to be heard, acknowledged, and finally restored to the hands they were stolen from. When World War II ended, Europe was broken, but the stolen art remained scattered across the continent. Allied forces had recovered millions of objects, yet identifying rightful owners became one of the most complex moral challenges of the post-war world. Warehouses overflowed with paintings, sculptures, books, and gold. Each item carried a story, but many stories had no surviving voice. In the late 1940s, Allied governments attempted restitution. Some artworks were returned quickly to countries of origin, not individuals. This decision created new problems. Governments claimed ownership over pieces that had once belonged to private families. In many cases, Jewish heirs were never informed that their family collections had been found. Silence replaced justice. As Europe rebuilt, priorities shifted. Cold War politics took center stage. Museums reopened, eager to restore cultural pride. Stolen artworks quietly entered public collections, often labeled with vague descriptions, like former European collection. Questions about provenance were ignored. For decades, looted art hung on museum walls while families searched in the dark. In the United States and Canada, many Holocaust survivors started new lives. They carried memories, not inventories. Documents had been destroyed. Names were misspelled. Borders had changed. For survivors, proving ownership felt impossible. Legal systems demanded evidence that no longer existed. Time became the greatest enemy of justice. The turning point came in the 1990 seconds as archives opened in Eastern Europe and Nazi records were declassified. The truth began to surface. Journalists, historians, and lawyers uncovered proof of systematic theft. In 1998, the Washington Conference on Holocaust-era assets forced governments and museums to confront the past. Principles were established calling for fair and just solutions. Suddenly, provenance mattered. Museums were pressured to investigate how artworks entered their collections. Some institutions cooperated, others resisted, fearing reputational damage and financial loss. Lawsuits followed. Families that had lost everything now had to fight powerful institutions for what was once theirs. One of the most famous cases involved Gustav Klimt's paintings seized from the Bloch-Bauer family. After years of legal battles, the artworks were returned to the heirs, including the iconic portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer. The case sent shockwaves through the art world. It proved restitution was possible. Yet, for every success story, hundreds remain unresolved. Many heirs still do not know what was stolen. Others know, but cannot afford legal battles. Some artworks remain hidden in private collections, traded quietly. Their histories buried beneath auction records. The return of Nazi-looted art is not just about objects. It is about restoring dignity. Each return challenges the idea that time can erase. Each restitution acknowledges a crime that once went unpunished. By the early 2000s, the battle over Nazi-looted art had moved into courtrooms around the world. Heirs were no longer just asking museums for cooperation. They were demanding accountability. In the United States, new laws allowed families to file claims even decades after the original thefts. This legal shift changed everything. American courts became central to restitution cases because many stolen artworks had passed through the U.S. art market after the war. Dealers, collectors, and auction houses had bought and sold pieces without fully examining their origins. In some cases, they chose not to ask questions. The past was profitable when left unexplored. Museums defended themselves by arguing good faith purchases and legal ownership. Heirs argued moral truth. Judges were forced to weigh technical law against historical injustice. These cases were slow, expensive, and emotionally exhausting. For many families, the legal fight lasted longer than the war itself. Canada faced similar challenges. Public institutions began reviewing their collections, often discovering uncomfortable truths. Paintings donated by wealthy collectors were revealed to have dark histories. Each discovery raised public pressure. Newspapers published stories. Trust was tested. Museums had to decide whether preserving reputation mattered more than correcting history. Technology played a crucial role. Digital archives scanned Nazi records, and international databases allowed researchers to trace artworks across borders. A single stamp, inventory number, or photograph could unlock an entire history. What was once hidden in boxes became accessible worldwide. The past was no longer silent. Private collectors became a new focus. Unlike museums, they operated behind closed doors. Some cooperated and returned artworks quietly. Others fought fiercely, claiming ignorance or legal protection. In these cases, public opinion became a powerful weapon. No collector wanted to be known for owning stolen Holocaust art. One striking pattern emerged. Many heirs were not wealthy art elites. They were teachers, engineers, retirees. Their families had once owned priceless works, yet lived modest lives after the war. When art was returned, some kept it as a memorial. Others sold it to fund education, charity, or simply closure. There was no single response to restitution, only deeply personal ones. Governments also faced criticism. Some countries were accused of delaying claims or hiding archives. International pressure increased. Human rights organizations argued that restitution was not optional. It was a moral obligation tied directly to Holocaust remembrance. Despite progress, resistance remained strong. Statutes of limitation blocked claims. Evidence was dismissed. Time continued to favor institutions over families, yet each successful return set a precedent. Each case reminded the world that ownership, obtained through genocide, could never be truly clean. As restitution cases gained global attention, museums faced a turning point. For decades, many institutions had positioned themselves as neutral guardians of culture. Now, they were being forced to confront an uncomfortable reality. Some of the world's most respected museums were holding art taken from families destroyed by the Holocaust. In the United States, several museums began internal provenance investigations. Teams of researchers were hired to trace the ownership history of artworks acquired between 1933 and 1945. What they found was troubling. Missing years, altered records, sales made under duress. Each gap told a story of fear, coercion, or forced exile. Public response mattered. When museums resisted claims, protests followed. Donors questioned ethics. Visitors demanded transparency. Slowly, a shift began. Some institutions chose cooperation over confrontation. They published online databases listing artworks with questionable origins. This transparency marked progress, but it also exposed how much had been ignored. High-profile cases continued to shape the debate. In one case, a museum argued that returning a painting would damage public access to culture. Heirs responded that public enjoyment could never outweigh private suffering. The argument cut to the heart of restitution. Is art more valuable on a wall or in the hands of those it was stolen from? Canada saw similar debates. Cultural institutions faced pressure to align with international restitution standards. Some museums returned works quietly, without public announcements. Others fought claims for years. Each decision sent a message about how a nation remembered the Holocaust, not in words, but in actions. A new generation of heirs stepped forward during this period. Grandchildren and great-grandchildren of original owners began filing claims. Many had grown up hearing fragments of stories. A painting mentioned at dinner, a home described but never seen. Restitution became a way to reconnect with family history that had been interrupted by violence. Art dealers and auction houses also changed behavior. Provenance checks became stricter. Red flags were taken seriously. The market learned that ignoring history carried risks. A painting linked to Nazi looting could lose value overnight. Ethics and economics began moving in the same direction. Still, critics argued progress was too slow. Thousands of artworks remained unclaimed or unresolved. Bureaucracy, legal loopholes, and national pride continued to block justice. In some countries, restitution depended on political will rather than clear law. Yet something irreversible had happened. The conversation had changed. Nazi-looted art was no longer a niche issue for historians. It became a public test of moral responsibility. Museums, once silent, were being watched. Collectors, once hidden, were being named. Part 4 of this journey reveals a hard truth. Restitution is not about the past alone. Behind every restitution case lies a human story, often marked by loss that no legal victory can fully repair. For many heirs, the fight to recover Nazi-looted art is not driven by money, but by memory. These artworks are among the few surviving links to families and lives destroyed during World War II. As paintings were returned, emotional moments followed. Some heirs described feeling as if a stolen voice had been given back. Others felt grief resurface, sharper than expected. Standing before a painting once owned by grandparents meant confronting everything that was taken alongside it. Restitution reopened wounds, but it also allowed healing to begin. In several cases, heirs chose to loan returned artworks to museums. This decision surprised critics. Why give back what was just reclaimed? For many families, sharing the art publicly was an act of control. Unlike the past, the choice was now theirs. The artwork no longer represented theft. It represented survival. Education became a central part of restitution. Museums that returned artworks often partnered with heirs to tell the full story. Labels were rewritten. Names of original owners were restored. Visitors learned not just about the artist, but about the family who once lived with the painting on their wall. Art became testimony, yet emotional closure was not guaranteed. Some families discovered that their collections had been sold piece by piece, scattered across continents. Recovery of one artwork only highlighted how many others were still missing. The sense of incompleteness remained. Psychologists studying Holocaust trauma noted something powerful. Restitution helped descendants reclaim narrative ownership. For generations, families had been defined by what was done to them. Recovering art allowed them to define themselves by what they valued, created, and preserved. It shifted identity from victimhood to continuity. Not all outcomes were positive. Some heirs faced public scrutiny and online backlash after high-value restitutions. Accusations of greed ignored the history behind the claims. This response revealed how uncomfortable society still is with confronting long-term consequences of genocide. World War II officially ended in 1945, but for these families, its shadow remains present. Artworks act as witnesses. They carry silence, beauty, and trauma at once. When returned, they force societies to face the human cost behind museum walls and auction headlines. In the United States and Canada, restitution cases influenced Holocaust education programs. Schools and universities began using real art recovery stories to teach students about moral responsibility. History became personal. The abstract became tangible. Part 5 shows that restitution is not the end of a story. It is a chapter of reckoning. Each returned artwork is both a reunion and a reminder. It asks viewers to see beyond the frame, to recognize the family that once gathered around it. As restitution efforts continued, a new challenge emerged. What happens to the countless Nazi-looted artworks whose owners will never be found? Millions were murdered in the Holocaust. Entire family lines were erased. In many cases, there are no heirs left to claim what was stolen. These objects exist in a moral gray zone. Museums and governments struggled with this reality. Some institutions labeled such works as orphaned art. Others placed them in storage, unsure how to proceed. Keeping them on display felt wrong. Returning them felt impossible. Each option carried ethical weight. International organizations proposed solutions. Some argued that unclaimed art should be used for Holocaust education and remembrance. Others suggested selling the works and donating proceeds to survivor support programs. Critics warned that monetizing stolen art risked repeating injustice. The debate revealed how deeply unresolved the legacy of Nazi looting remains. Another layer of complexity involved countries of origin. Eastern European nations claimed cultural loss, arguing that artworks belonged to national heritage, not private families. Jewish organizations countered that Nazi theft targeted individuals first, nations second. These disagreements slowed restitution and fueled diplomatic tension. Technology once again reshaped the field. Artificial intelligence and image recognition tools began matching old black and white photographs with paintings hanging in museums today. Lost art resurfaced through pixels and algorithms. A painting seen in a 1938 living room photo could suddenly reappear in a modern gallery. History found new ways to speak. Younger generations became key drivers. Descendants who grew up in the digital age took on research themselves. They built databases, shared information online, and connected across borders. Restitution was no longer confined to courtrooms. It became a global, collaborative effort powered by memory and persistence. Still, resistance endured. Some institutions argued that reopening claims threatened cultural stability. Others cited legal exhaustion. But public opinion continued to shift. Surveys showed growing support for restitution, especially among younger audiences in the United States and Canada. Moral clarity was replacing legal avoidance. World War II looting is now studied as one of the largest cultural crimes in history. It revealed how genocide extends beyond bodies to belongings, stories, and identity. Art theft was not random. It was systematic, and its consequences are still unfolding. Part 6 underscores a difficult truth. Restitution is not a problem that can be fully solved. It is a responsibility that must be continuously faced. Each unresolved artwork is a question left hanging. Each recovered piece is a partial answer. The return of Nazi-looted treasures is not about closing a chapter. It is about refusing to let it be forgotten, as long as stolen art exists without truth attached to it. In recent years, governments have been forced to confront their own roles in delaying justice. Some nations had signed restitution agreements, yet failed to enforce them. Others buried claims in bureaucracy. Survivors and heirs accused officials of waiting for claimants to die, allowing cases to quietly disappear. In the United States, new legislation strengthened the rights of heirs. The Holocaust, Expropriated Art Recovery Act, removed time limits that had blocked claims for decades. Courts were instructed to consider historical context, not just technical deadlines. This law acknowledged a simple truth: theft under genocide cannot be treated like ordinary property loss. Canada followed with increased transparency initiatives. Museums were encouraged to publish provenance records and cooperate with claimants. While progress varied by institution, public accountability increased. Silence was no longer acceptable. European countries faced sharper criticism. Some had benefited directly from Nazi redistribution of art. Others had returned items selectively, favoring national collections. International watchdog groups monitored compliance and publicly named non-cooperative institutions. Reputation became leverage. Media exposure played a powerful role. Documentaries, investigative reports, and survivor interviews brought restitution into living rooms. Viewers saw not just paintings, but faces, names, families. This visibility made denial harder and empathy unavoidable. Art law evolved as a discipline. Universities introduced courses focused entirely on cultural, property, and wartime theft. Young lawyers entered the field driven by ethics rather than profit. Restitution was becoming professionalized, ensuring future cases would be handled with greater skill and sensitivity. However, political shifts threatened progress. Rising nationalism in some countries framed restitution as foreign pressure. Claims were dismissed as attacks on national pride. This resistance echoed old patterns of avoidance, reminding the world that history can be distorted again if not defended. Despite obstacles, victories continued. Paintings were returned from major museums. Private collectors settled claims. Auction houses canceled sales when red flags appeared. Each action reinforced a growing norm. Owning stolen Holocaust art was no longer socially defensible. For heirs, time remained precious. Many claimants were elderly. Each year mattered. Courts recognized urgency. Some cases were fast-tracked. Others stalled. Justice moved at uneven speeds, but it moved. Part 7 shows restitution as a living process shaped by law, politics, and public will. It is not guaranteed. It must be protected. Each generation decides whether to continue the work or let it fade. The story of Nazi-looted art is ultimately a test of values. It asks whether comfort will outweigh conscience, whether institutions will protect possessions. As restitution entered the modern era, the role of museums began to transform in a deeper way. No longer could institutions remain passive holders of art. They were becoming active participants in historical accountability. This shift marked a cultural turning point in how societies understood ownership, memory, and responsibility. Some museums in the United States adopted restitution-first policies. When credible evidence of Nazi looting emerged, these institutions chose negotiation over litigation. Instead of waiting for lawsuits, they reached out to potential heirs. This proactive approach rebuilt trust and set new ethical standards across the museum world. Digital transparency became essential. Online databases allowed the public to search collections for artworks with gaps in ownership history. Scholars, heirs, and journalists could access information once locked away. The walls of museums were no longer barriers. Knowledge became shared. In Canada, collaboration with Jewish organizations increased. Museums invited descendants to participate in exhibitions that addressed looting directly. These displays did not hide controversy, they explained it. Visitors learned how paintings moved from private homes to Nazi vaults, and then into modern institutions. Museums became places of reckoning, not just admiration. This evolution was not without resistance. Some curators worried that constant focus on theft would overshadow artistic value. Others argued that museums should remain neutral. Critics responded that neutrality had allowed injustice to persist for decades. Silence, they said, was never neutral. Artists also entered the conversation. Contemporary works began responding to looted art histories. Installations featured empty frames, erased names, and missing objects. These pieces forced audiences to confront absence as much as presence. Art itself became a tool of remembrance. Education expanded beyond classrooms. Guided tours, lectures, and digital storytelling made restitution accessible to wider audiences. Younger generations, raised on social justice movements, connected deeply with these narratives. For them, returning stolen art was not charity, it was accountability. At the same time, unresolved cases continued to surface. New claims emerged from old photographs, forgotten letters, and newly opened archives. Each discovery reminded the world that restitution was ongoing, not finished. The past remained active. Part 8 highlights a powerful idea. Restitution is reshaping institutions from the inside. Museums are no longer just guardians of objects. They are guardians of truth. Their choices influence how history is remembered and how future injustices will be judged. The journey from Hitler's vaults to Heirs' hands is not just about returning what was stolen. It is about redefining cultural ethics. It asks whether beauty can exist without honesty, whether admiration can coexist with accountability. As museums change, as restitution efforts matured, the focus began to shift from recovery alone to long-term responsibility. The question was no longer only how stolen art could be returned, but how future generations would remember why it mattered. Memory became the final battlefield. Holocaust survivors were aging. Many passed away before seeing justice completed. Their children and grandchildren carried the mission forward, often feeling a duty rather than a choice. For them, restitution was about honoring voices that history tried to silence. Each claim became an act of remembrance. In the United States and Canada, restitution stories entered popular culture. Films, books, and documentaries reached audiences far beyond museums and courtrooms. These stories reframed art theft not as a niche legal issue, but as a human rights failure with lasting consequences. Public understanding deepened. Education systems adapted. Universities integrated restitution cases into history, law, and ethics courses. Students studied not only what was stolen, but why it was allowed to remain hidden for so long. The lesson was clear. Injustice survives when people look away. Some families chose to donate restituted artworks to public institutions with strict conditions. The full history had to be displayed. The original owners' names had to be permanent. This approach transformed art into living evidence. Paintings no longer existed without context. Still, unresolved pain remained. Many heirs expressed frustration that apologies were rare. Institutions returned art, but often avoided acknowledging wrongdoing. For families, silence felt like unfinished justice. Restitution without recognition could feel hollow. At the same time, global cooperation increased. International databases connected museums, researchers, and claimants. Borders mattered less. Information flowed faster. A painting stolen in Paris could be identified in New York within days. The world was learning to work together against historical theft. Part 9 reveals that restitution is as much about the future as the past. It asks how societies teach memory, whether museums, schools, and governments will preserve truth or allow convenience to rewrite history again. The legacy of Nazi-looted art is not just found in recovered masterpieces. It is found in changed behavior, in stricter standards, in questions asked before purchases are made, in the refusal to accept beauty without truth. As fewer survivors remain, responsibility shifts fully to institutions and descendants. The burden of memory becomes collective. The art itself becomes a messenger, reminding viewers that culture can be weaponized, but it can also be restored. The journey from Hitler's vaults to Heirs' hands is nearing its final phase. But it is not ending. Each generation must decide whether to protect the lessons learned or repeat the mistakes of silence. Part 9 stands as a warning and a hope. A warning that forgetting invites repetition. The story of Nazi-looted art does not end with the final return or a closed courtroom door. It ends with a responsibility that continues long after the last claim is filed. Part 10 is not about recovery alone. It is about reckoning. From Hitler's vaults to Heirs' hands, the journey of these stolen treasures reveals how deeply injustice can embed itself into everyday institutions. Museums, auction houses, and private collections became silent witnesses to crimes committed decades earlier. For years, the world chose admiration over accountability. That choice is now being challenged. Restitution has shown that time does not erase theft. Paintings do not forget the hands they were taken from. Each recovered artwork stands as proof that history leaves marks, even when covered by frames, labels, and prestige. For heirs, justice often arrived late. Parents and grandparents did not live to see it. Yet many families describe restitution as a message sent backward through time, a statement that what was stolen was recognized, that suffering was acknowledged, that memory was restored. In the United States and Canada, restitution has reshaped how cultural ownership is understood. Art is no longer viewed only as an object of beauty or investment. It is understood as evidence. Evidence of lives interrupted, families erased, and cultures targeted for destruction. This process has also forced institutions to confront uncomfortable truths. Neutrality was revealed as a myth. Choices were made. Silence was maintained. And now, responsibility must be owned. Restitution is not an admission of weakness. It is an act of moral strength. Still, much remains unresolved. Thousands of artworks are missing. Many families will never know what was taken. Justice, in these cases, can only be symbolic. But symbols matter. They shape values. They teach future generations what will and will not be tolerated. The final lesson of this journey is simple but demanding. History is not only what happened, it is what is allowed to remain uncorrected. When societies choose convenience over truth, injustice survives. When they choose courage, it weakens. Art cannot undo genocide, but it can carry memory forward. It can remind viewers that beauty and brutality once traveled together, and that separating them requires honesty. Part 10 closes the series with the challenge to the present. The question is no longer whether stolen art should be returned. That answer is clear. The question is whether the world will continue to act when attention fades and headlines disappear. Because the return of Nazi-looted treasures is not about the past staying alive. It is about the future being held accountable. What was taken by force must never be protected by silence again. And as long as one stolen artwork remains without truth attached to it, the work of justice is not finished. Even after decades of research, court rulings, and public apologies, the story of Nazi-looted art remains unfinished. Part 11 looks beyond restitution and asks what lasting justice truly means when history has been so violently disrupted. For many families, the return of a painting does not restore what was lost. Homes, communities, languages, and entire bloodlines cannot be returned. Yet restitution offers something: recognition. It tells the world that these families existed, that their lives mattered, and that what was taken from them was wrong. As time passes, urgency increases. Physical witnesses to World War II are nearly gone. Soon, there will be no survivors left to testify in person. Responsibility shifts fully to records, institutions, and conscience. The danger is not denial alone, but indifference. When memory fades, injustice finds space to survive again. Some experts warn of a new risk. As restitution becomes normalized, it may also become routine. Checklists may replace reflection. Paperwork may replace empathy. Part 11 serves as a reminder that restitution is not an administrative task. It is a moral act that demands care and respect every time. The art world now faces a defining question. Will it treat Nazi-looted art as a closed chapter or as a permanent lesson? Provenance research must not slow once headlines fade. Museums must not wait for pressure. Ethical responsibility must remain active, not reactive. In the United States and Canada, future generations will inherit this duty. Students studying these cases today will become curators, lawyers, collectors, and policymakers tomorrow. Their choices will decide whether the mistakes of the past stay corrected or quietly return. Technology will continue to uncover truths. Lost archives will resurface. New matches will be made. Each discovery will reopen old wounds, but also offer new chances to do what earlier generations avoided. The work will be uncomfortable. That is exactly why it matters. Part 11 emphasizes a final truth. Restitution is not about perfection. It is about persistence. It is about refusing to accept stolen history as settled history. It is about choosing action over silence, again and again. The journey from Hitler's vaults to Heirs' hands is one of the longest paths justice has ever taken. It crosses war zones, courtrooms, museums, and living rooms. It moves through grief, resistance, and resolve. And it proves something essential, that even when injustice feels permanent, it can still be challenged. This series ends here, but the story does not. Somewhere another painting waits. Another family searches. Another truth is buried in a record box or a forgotten photograph. As long as that is the case, the responsibility remains. History does not ask whether it is convenient to remember. It asks whether we will. And the answer, and through every act of restitution, has continued to be yes.